the year 261 before Christ, the plain of Kalinga, on the eastern coast of the Indian subcontinent. The air, thick and humid from the proximity of the ocean, is saturated with the heavy, cloying smell of blood and decay. It hangs over the land in a dense, almost tangible haze, mingling with the smoke from funeral pyres that have been burning for many days and nights, yet are unable to consume all traces of the monstrous slaughter. Over the field there is a ceaseless, monotonous buzzing of swarms of carrion flies, drowning out all other sounds. The earth, once covered with emerald carpets of rice paddies, has turned into a crimson, viscous mud, where clay has mixed with the blood of hundreds of thousands of people and war elephants. Here and there, broken spears, shattered shields, and the splintered axles of chariots jut out from the bloody mess, resembling the skeletons of prehistoric monsters. Across this terrible field, among mountains of mangled bodies, stepping between broken chariots and abandoned banners bearing the emblems of Kalinga, a solitary figure moves slowly. It is he, the third emperor of the Mauryan dynasty, grandson of the great Chandragupta, the unifier of lands who challenged the heirs of Alexander the Great himself, son of Bindusara, nicknamed the Slayer of Enemies, who extended the empire's borders to the very heart of the south. His own name, Ashoka, which in Sanskrit means without sorrow, or he who causes no pain. The irony of this name here, on this field of death, is more deafening than the cries of the dying that still echo here and there, merging with the desperate screams of vultures circling in the incandescent sky. He has been on the throne for 8 years. For 8 years he has followed in the footsteps of his formidable ancestors, expanding the empire with iron and blood, following the precepts of the pragmatic and ruthless Arthashastra. Kalinga was the last defiant kingdom, a bold and rich splinter on the eastern frontier of his colossal domain. It was not just a state, but a civilization of seafarers and merchants whose ships plied the Bay of Bengal, whose warriors were famed for their pride and valor. It was a strategic necessity, a key to maritime trade routes, a jewel that had to be set in his imperial crown. And he took it. He took it in the course of one of the most brutal and bloody battles in the history of the ancient world. Now he is the victor. His power is absolute. His empire stretches from the snow-capped peaks of the Hindu Kush in the northwest to the Ganges Delta in the east, from the foothills of the Himalayas to the heart of the Deccan Plateau. He is the lord of almost the entire subcontinent, a Chakravartin, a universal monarch, the most powerful ruler on earth. But there is no triumph in his eyes. He walks, and his gaze glides over the silent witnesses of his victory. Here lies a warrior of Kalinga, his fingers still clutching the hilt of a broken sword. Here is a pile of bodies, among which one can discern women and old men who defended their homes to their last breath. He sees the faces of children frozen in a silent scream. He hears not the triumphal shouts of his soldiers praising his name, but the soundless wail and curses in the eyes of the survivors, the weeping of widows and orphans carried from the ravaged villages, whose smoking ruins are visible on the horizon. Buddhist chronicles written centuries later claim that over 100,000 people were killed in this war, and another 150,000 were driven into slavery. Figures that, even for a battle-hardened ruler, were not just statistics, but an abyss that had opened at his feet. He had conquered a kingdom, but what had he gained? A land soaked in tears and blood, subjects whose hearts are filled with hatred and fear. Victory had turned into defeat, not a military one, but a spiritual one. At this very moment, amidst the horror and despair, an earthquake began in the emperor's soul, one that would shatter the old Ashoka and, on his ruins, erect a completely different figure. A figure that would change not only his own life, but the fate of millions, transforming a local philosophical teaching into one of the world's religions. This is a story of a double transformation, of how a prince, not the most beloved son, carved his path to the throne through intrigues and possibly the blood of his brothers, of how a ruthless conqueror who had brought the art of war to bloody perfection transformed into history's greatest champion of peace and non-violence. This is the story of Ashoka, the emperor who attempted to build an empire based not on fear but on compassion. The empire of Dharma. But to understand the depth of this fall and the height of this ascent, we must return to the very beginning, to the world that gave birth to the Mauryan dynasty, to a world of intrigues, great ambitions, and philosophical insights. Before Ashoka appeared on the historical stage, the land of the Indian subcontinent was a seething cauldron of kingdoms, philosophical schools, and political ambitions. Northern India was divided into 16 great kingdoms, or Mahajanapadas, constantly at war with each other. Koshala, Vatsa, Avanti, and the most powerful of them, Magadha, gradually absorbed their neighbors, waging an endless struggle for the fertile lands of the Ganges Valley and control over trade routes. Magadha, possessing inexhaustible reserves of iron ore and timber, as well as the ability to field huge armies of elephants, had a decisive advantage. And in the northwest, the shadow of the greatest conqueror of the West still lingered. Just a few decades earlier, in 326 BCE, the armies of Alexander the Great had crossed the Indus. His campaign was like a hurricane, swift, devastating, but brief. He had defeated the army of King Porus in the grand battle of the Hydaspes, where the Macedonian phalanx had faced a hitherto unseen opponent, hundreds of war elephants. It was a victory bought at a high price. The roar and fury of these living mountains terrified even Alexander's hardened veterans, and the sight of elephants trampling and goring warriors with their tusks left an indelible psychological scar. The Greeks were struck not only by the military aspect but also by the philosophical depth of India. They met with astonishment the gymnosophists, naked wise men, ascetics who despised material wealth and demonstrated astonishing fortitude of spirit. This culture shock, the mutual amazement of two great civilizations, left its mark on the memory of both. Wearied by years of campaigning and frightened by rumors of the innumerable armies and thousands of war elephants of the Nanda kingdom to the east, his soldiers refused to go further. Alexander turned back, leaving behind Greek garrisons, satraps, and a persistent sense that the vast, rich world beyond Persia was vulnerable. But Alexander's hurricane left behind not only destruction, but also a power vacuum. The Greek presence in the Punjab was precarious, and the dominant power in the Ganges Valley, the Nanda Empire, was a colossus with feet of clay. The Nanda dynasty, ruling from its magnificent capital Pataliputra, had accumulated immense wealth. Ancient authors, citing Indian sources, wrote of their huge army, numbering 200,000 infantry, tens of thousands of cavalry, and thousands of war elephants. Their treasuries overflowed with gold acquired through a ruthless and efficient system of taxation that levied tribute on everything from land to handicrafts, causing deep-seated resentment. But their rule was hated by many. The founder of the dynasty, Mahapadma Nanda, was, according to tradition, of low birth, possibly the son of a barber, which earned him the contempt of the traditional aristocracy, the Kshatriyas. His descendants inherited his power and wealth, but not his grip, becoming famous for their greed and cruelty. And while the last of the Nandas, Dana Nanda, reveled in his power, in the shadows, on the periphery of political life, forces were maturing that were destined to crush him. Here, at the intersection of history and legend, two figures appear, inextricably linked, whose partnership would become the foundation for the greatest empire in the history of India. And while the great powers were carving up the map of the world, in a quiet province, far from the splendor of capitals, A boy was growing up who was destined to wear the imperial crown. His name was Chandragupta, but the path to the heights of power would be long and arduous, and his guide on this path would be one of the most outstanding and cynical minds of his era. History rarely gives us the opportunity to peer so deeply into the minds of ancient political strategists as in the case of Chanakya, also known by the names Kautilya and Vishnugupta. This Brahmin from Taxila, a major educational and cultural center in the northwest, was the quintessence of political realism. Legends shroud his figure in mist, but through it emerges the image of a brilliant, perceptive, ruthless, and incredibly determined man. One legend has it that Chanakya came to the court of Nanda in Pataliputra to participate in the distribution of gifts to Brahmins. Seeing him, unassuming and, according to some versions, ugly, the king flew into a rage and ordered him to be thrown out. Humiliated, Chanakya, before leaving the hall, untied the sacred knot in his hair and swore that he would not tie it again until he had destroyed the entire Nanda dynasty. This story, though apocryphal, perfectly reflects his character. Proud, unbending, and vengeful. But Chanakya was not just a vengeful schemer. He was the author of the Arthashastra, a treatise on politics, economics, and the art of war, which can be considered the ancient Indian equivalent of Machiavelli's works, but written 1,500 years earlier. The Arthashastra, which can be translated as the science of material gain, or the science of politics, is a cold and pragmatic textbook on statecraft. For Chanakya, the well-being and security of the state were the highest goals, justifying any means. Espionage, disinformation, secret assassinations, provocations, strict control over all spheres of life. All these were just tools in the hands of a wise ruler to maintain order and prosperity. The treatise advised the king to use agents of influence, including even astrologers and fortune-tellers, to shape public opinion and instill belief in the ruler's divine destiny. It described in detail how a spy network should be organized using students, merchants, ascetics, and even courtesans as agents. It discussed how to sow discord in enemy camps, how to replenish the treasury with clever taxes, and how to maintain discipline in the army. In his world, there was a complex theory of foreign policy, the so-called mandala, where a neighboring state is by definition an enemy, and the state beyond it a natural ally. It was a world where morality receded before state necessity. And to implement his ideas, Chanakya needed a ruler who was strong, decisive, and ambitious, and he found him. Chandragupta's origin, like that of many great figures of antiquity, is obscure. Later texts call him a scion of the Maurya dynasty, connected to the Shakya clan, to which the Buddha himself belonged. Other earlier and possibly more reliable sources point to his humble origins, perhaps from a caste associated with peacocks, which is Mayura in Sanskrit. Legend has it that Chanakya found the young Chandragupta playing king and his subjects with his friends. Struck by the boy's natural regal bearing and intelligence, Chanakya bought him from his adoptive shepherd parents and took him to Taxila to give him the best education in military affairs, politics, and economics. It was in Taxila, according to some accounts, that the young Chandragupta may have met Alexander the Great himself. Plutarch mentions that a certain Sandrocotus, the Hellenized version of the name Chandragupta, spoke boldly with Alexander and later claimed that the Macedonian king could have easily conquered all of India, as the Nanda ruler was hated by his people. Under Chanakya's guidance, Chandragupta transformed into a formidable warrior and a cunning leader. When Alexander left India, they saw their chance. Gathering an army of mercenaries, bandits, and all who were discontented with the rule of the Nandas and the Greeks, they began their war. First, they expelled the remnants of the Greek garrisons from the Punjab, uniting the northwest under their banner. Then, having accumulated forces, they moved east, towards the heart of the enemy empire, towards Magadha. The war with the Nandas was brutal, but Chanakya and Chandragupta used not only brute force. Their spies sowed discord in the capital. Their propaganda turned the people against the greedy king. Finally, around 322 BCE, Chandragupta's army entered Pataliputra. The Nanda dynasty was overthrown. Chandragupta ascended the throne, founding a new dynasty, the Mauryas. Chanakya's dream had come true, but this was only the beginning. Having become emperor, Chandragupta, guided by Chanakya's wisdom, began to create the centralized and efficient state described in the Arthashastra. A ramified bureaucratic system was created to manage tax collection, road and irrigation system construction, jurisprudence, and the maintenance of order. The empire was divided into provinces headed by governors, often from among the royal relatives. A unified currency was introduced which promoted economic growth. A huge army, which became the most powerful on the subcontinent, was supported by the state. According to ancient authors, it numbered over 600,000 infantry, 30,000 cavalry, and 9,000 war elephants, a force capable of crushing any opponent. Soon, the new empire had to face a serious test. Seleucus Nicator, one of the Diadochi, or successors of Alexander, who had founded the Seleucid Empire on the ruins of the Macedonian king's eastern conquests, decided to bring India back under Hellenistic control. Around 305 BCE, he invaded the Punjab, but he met not scattered principalities as Alexander had, but a unified mighty Mauryan Empire. The details of the conflict are unknown, but the result speaks for itself. By the peace treaty, Seleucus not only renounced his claims but also ceded vast territories west of the Indus to Chandragupta, including parts of modern-day Afghanistan and Balochistan. In return, Chandragupta gave him 500 war elephants. This gift proved decisive, as it was these elephants that played a key role in Seleucus's victory over his rival Antigonus at the Battle of Ipsus, changing the balance of power in the Hellenistic world. The alliance was sealed by a dynastic marriage. Probably a daughter or relative of Seleucus became one of Chandragupta's wives. A Greek ambassador named Megasthenes arrived in the Mauryan capital, Pataliputra. His work, the Indica, and unfortunately preserved only in fragments and summaries by other ancient authors, is an invaluable source of information about the Mauryan Empire. Megasthenes described Pataliputra with admiration as one of the greatest cities in the world, surrounded by a massive wooden wall with 570 towers and 64 gates. He wrote about the complex administrative system, divided into 6 committees of 5 men each, which managed everything from overseeing industrial production and crafts to caring for foreigners and registering births and deaths. He described the country's wealth and prosperity, noting the astonishing honesty of the people who knew almost no theft and the absence of slavery in its Greek sense. He also described the emperor's lifestyle, who lived in a huge, richly decorated wooden palace and appeared in public only for trials, sacrifices, or hunts, always surrounded by an armed guard of women. This unique detail, a female guard, underscored the monarch's distrust of his entourage, which was quite in keeping with the paranoid atmosphere prescribed in the Arthashastra. It was said that the emperor never slept in the same room 2 nights in a row, fearing conspiracies and assassins. Chandragupta ruled for about 24 years. His end, like his beginning, is shrouded in legends. Jain tradition asserts that at the end of his life, he abdicated the throne in favor of his son, Bindusara, became a follower of Jainism, and went south to Shravanabelagola, where he ended his days in asceticism, starving himself to death. Whether this is true or not, his legacy was undeniable. From chaos and fragmentation guided by the genius of Chanakya, he created a unified, powerful, and prosperous empire, laying the foundation upon which his grandson Ashoka would build his unique state. It seemed the world was frozen in a fragile equilibrium, held together by the iron will of the empire's founders. But beneath the surface, forces were maturing, ready to shatter this order, and at the center of this gathering storm were the sons of the new emperor, each of whom saw himself as the heir to the great throne. Chandragupta's successor was his son Bindusara, who reigned from approximately 298 to 272 BCE. Considerably less is known about his reign than about that of his father and son, which sometimes makes him seem like a mere shadow between two giants. However, he was a worthy successor. He not only preserved but also strengthened the empire inherited from his father. Tamil sources and the Tibetan historian Taranatha credit him with conquests on the Deccan Plateau, extending the Mauryan Empire far to the south, almost to the very edge of the subcontinent. His nickname, Amitrakhata, which means slayer of enemies in Sanskrit, speaks for itself. He was not a custodian but a continuer of his father's work. Bindusara maintained the diplomatic relations with the Hellenistic world inherited from his father. Unlike his Jain father, if the legend is to be believed, he patronized the Ajivika school of philosophy, fatalistic ascetics, which speaks to his interest in spiritual matters. A story of his correspondence with the Seleucid king Antiochus the Fierce survives, in which the Indian ruler asked for sweet wine, dried figs, and a Greek sophist philosopher to be sent to him. Antiochus reportedly sent the wine and figs but politely refused to sell a philosopher, citing that Greek laws forbid it. This anecdote, though small, paints a picture of a world where cultures, despite vast distances, actively interacted. It was into this vast, prosperous, and ruthlessly efficient empire that the prince who was to change it beyond recognition was born. The grandson of Chandragupta, the son of Bindusara. His name was Ashoka. Ashoka, born around 304 BCE, was not the obvious heir to the throne. He was not the eldest son. Buddhist legends, seeking to emphasize his miraculous future transformation, paint his youth in rather dark colors. His mother, Subhadrangi, or Dharma, was, according to tradition, the daughter of a poor Brahmin, and held a low position in the royal harem, which was filled with wives and concubines. Ashoka himself, it is said, was not handsome, and his skin was rough, for which he was allegedly not loved by his father, Bindusara, who preferred his eldest son, Susima. However, if Bindusara did not hold any special affection for him, he could not fail to notice his son's talents and ambitions. Ashoka was bold, brave, and a skilled hunter, which, it is said, won the affection of his grandfather, the great conqueror Chandragupta. He grew up a fierce, hot-tempered, and extremely capable young man, who had absorbed the Kshatriya spirit of a warrior and ruler. These qualities did not go unnoticed. Bindusara appointed the young Ashoka as governor, or viceroy, in the important province of Avanti, with its capital in the prosperous city of Ujjain. This was not just an honorary post, but a serious test and a school of governance. Ujjain was not just a city. It was one of the greatest metropolises of ancient India, a major commercial and cultural center located at the crossroads of routes connecting northern India with the ports of the west coast and the southern regions. By governing Avanti, Ashoka proved his considerable administrative and military abilities. It was here in Ujjain that he met his first wife, Devi, or Vidisa Mahadevi. She was not a princess, but the daughter of a wealthy merchant from the neighboring city of Vidisha. and importantly a practicing Buddhist. This marriage was likely one of love, and it was Devi who became the mother of his first children, a son, Mahinda, and a daughter, Sangamita. Through her, Ashoka first came into contact with Buddhism not as an abstract philosophy, but as the living faith of a close person, which undoubtedly sowed the first seeds in his soul long before the Kalinga tragedy. Meanwhile, in another part of the empire, in Taxila, a major rebellion broke out. Taxila, an ancient center of learning and a gateway to Central Asia, was a restless province. The local population suffered from the arbitrariness and arrogance of Mauryan officials. The crown prince, Bindusara's eldest son named Susima, who was governor in Taxila, could not cope with the unrest. According to some sources, he was arrogant and not respected by either the people or at court. Then Bindusara made a fateful decision. He sent not Susima, but his younger, more decisive son, Ashoka, to suppress the rebellion. Legend has it that Ashoka arrived at Taxila without an army, but the city's inhabitants came out to meet him with gifts, declaring that they had rebelled not against the emperor or the prince, but against the evil ministers who had humiliated them. Ashoka entered the city without a fight, restoring order by his authority and power. This story is probably embellished, but the very fact that it was Ashoka and not the crown prince who was sent to resolve the crisis speaks volumes about his reputation at court and the growing rivalry between the brothers. The old emperor Bindusara was weakening, and as his life force faded, the tension in the vast palace in Pataliputra grew. Whispers in the corridors turned into open conspiracies. At stake was not just power, but the fate of the entire Mauryan Empire. The succession to the throne in those days was rarely peaceful and predetermined. It was not so much a right by birth as a test of strength, cunning, and ruthlessness. And in this deadly game, Ashoka was ready to risk everything. What happened next is one of the bloodiest and most controversial pages in Ashoka's biography. Our main sources here are the Buddhist chronicles, particularly from Sri Lanka. It is important to remember that these texts were written centuries after the events and had a clear purpose: to blacken Ashoka's name as much as possible before his conversion to Buddhism, to make his subsequent transformation even more striking and miraculous. Therefore, historians treat these accounts with caution. However, there is no smoke without fire, and these legends probably reflect the cruel reality of the struggle for power in the ancient world. According to these chronicles, there were two powerful factions at court. One supported the legitimate heir, Susima. The other, led by an influential minister named Radhagupta, who saw in Ashoka a more worthy, energetic, and capable ruler, was secretly preparing a coup. When Bindusara was on his deathbed, Susima was in Taxila. Learning of his father's illness, he hurried to the capital to claim his rights to the throne. Ashoka, who was in Ujjain, was also summoned to Pataliputra. Legend has it that upon arrival, with the support of Radhagupta and loyal courtiers, he seized control of the capital and the palace. When Susima approached the city, a trap was prepared for him. A pit was dug at the gate, filled with burning coals and covered over. Susima, unsuspecting, fell into the fiery trap and perished. But the bloodshed did not end there. The Ceylonese chronicles, the Dipavamsa and Mahavamsa, claim that Ashoka, to secure his throne from any possible claimants, carried out a monstrous massacre. He allegedly killed all his brothers, 99 in number, sparing only one, his full brother named Tissa. It was for this incredible cruelty that he earned his first fearsome nickname, Chanda Ashoka, or Ashoka the Fierce. Modern historians doubt the literal truth of this story. Killing 99 brothers seems more a symbolic exaggeration, a hyperbole designed to emphasize his tyranny than a real fact. Moreover, in his own inscriptions made many years later during his reign of Dharma, Ashoka mentions his brothers and their families living in different cities of the empire for whom he shows concern, which directly contradicts the legend of total extermination. Nevertheless, there is practically no doubt that Ashoka's rise to power was the result of a brutal struggle. A curious fact may serve as confirmation. About 4 years passed between the moment of his accession to the throne, around 272 or 273 BCE, and his official coronation, or Abhisheka, around 268 or 269 BCE. This 4-year gap is extremely unusual. Most historians agree that these years were spent by Ashoka suppressing resistance, eliminating rivals, and definitively establishing his sole authority over the vast empire. This was not just a palace intrigue, but most likely a full-scale civil war during which rebellions raised by supporters of his murdered brothers broke out across the country, and governors and generals loyal to them refused to swear allegiance to the usurper. Ashoka had to prove his right to the throne by force, conducting punitive expeditions and mercilessly executing all dissenters. Thus, Ashoka ascended the throne not as a peace-loving philosopher, but as a pragmatic and cruel ruler, hardened in intrigues and possibly a fratricidal war. He inherited from his father and grandfather not only an empire, but also the methods of governing it, based on the principles of the Arthashastra, where the end justifies the means. And the first years of his reign fully corresponded to this reputation. The world did not yet know that beneath the mask of Ashoka, the Fierce was a man capable of the deepest repentance, but years which were to be drenched in blood remained before that repentance. Having established himself on a throne washed with blood, the world finally saw the true face of the new emperor. And his name, Ashoka, and without sorrow, sounded like a sinister mockery. For in the first years of his reign, he brought only grief and fear to all who dared to stand in his way. The era of Chanda Ashoka, Ashoka the Fierce, had begun. He ruled with an iron fist, continuing the expansionist policy of his ancestors. The empire was his passion. Its expansion and strengthening were his main goals. Any disobedience, any hint of separatism in the distant provinces was suppressed with merciless cruelty. The army, a well-oiled machine of killing and subjugation, was his main instrument. An extensive network of spies created under Chandragupta and Chanakya permeated all layers of society, reporting to Pataliputra every careless word, every discontented glance. He was the ideal Kautilian monarch for whom the state was a living organism, and he, its brain, demanding complete control over every cell. His harem, according to legends, was full of hundreds of women, and he allegedly, in a fit of rage, ordered many of them executed for mocking his appearance. But the most gruesome symbol of this period of his reign became a legend, transmitted by later Buddhist authors, particularly the Chinese pilgrims Faxian and Xuanzang, who visited India many centuries later. This is the legend of Ashoka's Hell, or Ashoka Naraka. According to this tradition, Ashoka, obsessed with the idea of absolute control and punishment, ordered a special building to be constructed on the outskirts of the capital. Outwardly, it was beautiful, a veritable paradise garden with ponds, trees, and flowers to lure unsuspecting travelers. But inside was hidden an elaborate torture chamber, a chamber of horrors surpassing the most gruesome fantasies. This hell on earth was run by a man named Gurika, a cruel and ruthless executioner to whom Ashoka gave the order. Anyone who entered these gates, be it man, woman, or child, should not leave alive. The legends vividly describe the horrors of this place. Cauldrons of boiling oil, red-hot iron plates, instruments for crushing bones and flaying skin. It was a place where justice was replaced by sadism, and power showed its darkest side. One day, as the legend goes, a pious Buddhist monk named Samudra accidentally wandered into this paradise garden. When the executioner Garika seized him and prepared to throw him into a cauldron, the monk asked for only one thing: to be given time for a short meditation. Garika agreed, and then a miracle happened. The monk, having attained the state of an arhat, demonstrated his supernatural abilities. The flames did not harm him. He levitated above the cauldron, remaining unscathed. It was at this moment that Ashoka himself arrived at the hellish prison. Seeing the miracle, he was shaken to the core. The executioner Garika, true to his orders, tried to seize the emperor as well, reminding him of his own decree that no one who entered could leave. The enraged Ashoka killed the executioner and ordered the terrible structure to be razed to the ground. The encounter with an unshakable spiritual force in the midst of a kingdom of terror he himself had created became, according to this legend, the first jolt, the first crack in his armor of cruelty. Although the story of Ashoka's hell is most likely a fiction, created to dramatize his subsequent conversion, it perfectly reflects the reputation Ashoka earned in the early years of his reign. He was a ruler who did not scruple at any methods to strengthen his power. He was the pinnacle of the political system his grandfather had created, a system where the state was the absolute value and man merely a cog in its mechanism. The Mauryan Empire under him reached the peak of its territorial power. He annexed new lands in the south and possibly in the west, but one region remained, one rich and proud people who stubbornly refused to bow their heads to the lord of Pataliputra. This was the kingdom of Kalinga. On the eastern coast of the Indian subcontinent, washed by the waters of the Bay of Bengal, lay the prosperous kingdom of Kalinga, in the territory of the modern state of Odisha. It was not a wild and backward fringe. Kalinga was a state with an ancient history, a developed culture, a strong army, and most importantly, a thriving economy. For through its ports, a lively maritime trade with Southeast Asia and Ceylon was conducted. It controlled the land and sea routes between the Ganges Valley and the southern regions. Kalinga may have preserved republican or oligarchic forms of government, which was an ideological challenge to the absolute monarchy of the Mauryas. For the ambitious and methodical Emperor Ashoka, the independence of Kalinga was not just an annoying hindrance. It was a strategic challenge. An independent Kalinga broke the integrity of his empire, posed a threat to his trade interests, could serve as a refuge for political dissidents, and a potential ally for his enemies. Kalinga had previously been part of the Nanda Empire, but after their fall had managed to assert its independence. Now the Mauryas had come to claim what they considered theirs by right. This was not a routine border conflict. It was a full-scale invasion, the goal of which was the complete and final subjugation of the defiant kingdom. The people of Kalinga met the invaders with desperate courage. They fought for their land, for their freedom, for their homes. The battle was incredibly fierce. It was not an easy victory as Ashoka may have expected. The warriors of Kalinga, and even simple militiamen, offered stubborn resistance at every step. The chronicles have not preserved a detailed description of the battle itself, but we know of its consequences from a unique, unprecedented source. From the words of Ashoka himself. The main battle probably took place near the walls of Kalinga's capital, Tosali. The victory was complete. Kalinga's army was destroyed, its towns and villages ravaged, and its resistance broken. Ashoka had achieved his goal. The empire was unified, but the price of this victory was monstrous. In addition to the direct casualties of the battle, the devastation of fertile lands, the destruction of irrigation canals, and the enslavement of a huge number of peasants doomed the region to subsequent famine and epidemics, which claimed tens, if not hundreds of thousands more lives. It was then, after the battle, that the victorious emperor surveyed the battlefield. This was the very moment with which our story began. But now we understand its full depth. Before him was not just an abstract enemy. Before him were hundreds of thousands of killed and dying. And as his famous 13th Major Rock Edict, carved in stone years later, states, 150,000 people were deported from there, 100,000 were killed, and many times more died. These deported people walked in chains for thousands of kilometers. A slave's fate awaited them in the mines and construction sites of the empire, and many of them died on the way. In the same edict, he describes his feelings with astonishing frankness. He speaks not of glory but of strong remorse, sorrow, and regret. He writes that the conquest of an independent country means the killing, death, and deportation of people. And this suffering touched not only the warrior, it touched everyone. Brahmins, ascetics, followers of other sects, and householders who suffered from violence, death, or separation from their loved ones. Even those who have escaped death, Ashoka writes, whose love for their loved ones is undiminished, suffer from the misfortune that has befallen their friends, acquaintances, companions, and relatives. This portion of all men is a pain to my heart. This was a moment of truth. The triumph of power had turned into a complete personal collapse. His entire life, all his ambitions, all the principles by which he had lived and ruled crumbled to dust in the face of this ocean of human suffering, of which he was the cause. The conquest of Kalinga became the last war of Ashoka the conqueror. He had won the battle, but this battle had defeated him. Ashoka, Ashoka the Fierce, had died on the bloody fields of Kalinga, and from his ashes a new man was to be born. The victor of Kalinga returned to Pataliputra, a broken man. The greatness of his empire now seemed to him built on grief and tears, and his imperial mantle soaked in the blood of the innocent. The spiritual vacuum that had formed in his soul was immense. He sought answers, sought a path that could reconcile him with himself and with the world he had so cruelly conquered. And in this emptiness, the seeds of a new teaching found the most fertile soil. At that time, India was a veritable laboratory of spiritual quests. He sought answers, sought a path that could reconcile him with himself and with the world he had so cruelly conquered. And in this emptiness, the seeds of a new teaching found the most fertile soil. At that time, India was a veritable laboratory of spiritual quests. Alongside traditional Brahmanism with its complex rituals and rigid caste system, there were many so-called Shramana teachings. Jainism with its strictest ahimsa, Ajivika with its doctrine of fatalism, and of course, Buddhism. These teachings offered alternative paths to salvation, based on personal effort, asceticism, and philosophical insight. According to tradition, Ashoka began to show an interest in Buddhism. Gradually, step by step, Ashoka transformed from a mere inquirer into an upasaka, a lay follower of Buddhism. This was not a sudden revelation. It was a process, an evolution of views, which he himself speaks of in his edicts. The tragedy of Kalinga was the catalyst, but the conversion was gradual and profound, fueled probably by the influence of his wife Devi as well. He found in the Buddha's teaching what he was looking for, an ethical system based on compassion, nonviolence, and responsibility for one's actions. The key concept that became the basis of all his subsequent policy was the concept of Dharma, in Sanskrit, Dharma, in Prakrit, Dhamma. This word is multifaceted and cannot be translated with a single word. He found in the Buddha's teaching what he was looking for, an ethical system based on compassion, nonviolence, and responsibility for one's actions. The key concept that became the basis of all his subsequent policy was the concept of Dharma, in Sanskrit, Dharma, in Prakrit, Dhamma. This word is multifaceted and cannot be translated with a single word. It is law, order, virtue, and the right path. For Ashoka, Dharma was not just a synonym for the Buddhist religion. He interpreted it as a universal moral ethical code, understandable and acceptable to followers of all faiths in his diverse empire. He took the concept of Dharma, which had deep roots in Indian thought, and filled it with new humanistic content. He understood that in his vast empire inhabited by dozens of peoples with different beliefs, only mutual respect could prevent conflicts. Third, social responsibility. Care for his subjects became a sacred duty for him. He proclaimed himself the father of his people. Fourth, respect for elders. Reverence for parents, teachers, and all elders was an important part of Dharma. And fifth, truthfulness and moral purity. This was a revolutionary concept. For the first time in history, the ruler of such a vast empire tried to build his domestic and foreign policy not on the force of arms and fear, but on principles of ethics and compassion. Chanda Ashoka had definitively given way to Dhammashoka, Ashoka the Righteous. He marked his transformation with a pilgrimage to holy Buddhist sites. Instead of traditional royal excursions for hunting and entertainment, he undertook Dharma pilgrimages, or Dhamma Yatras. He visited Lumbini, where the Buddha was born, and in honor of this event, reduced taxes for the local inhabitants. He visited Bodh Gaya, where the Buddha attained enlightenment, Sarnath, where the first sermon was delivered, and Kushinagar, the place of his passing into parinirvana. In these places he erected commemorative pillars and stupas, prayed and distributed gifts. But Ashoka was not just a pious pilgrim. He remained an emperor, pragmatic and active, and he decided to turn his new faith into an effective state policy. He needed a way to convey his ideas to every corner of his vast domain, and he found it. How can an emperor speak to his people across the centuries? How to convey one's will not only to the capital's nobility but also to a simple peasant on a distant frontier, to a merchant in a port city, to a highlander in an inaccessible valley. Ashoka found a brilliant and timeless solution. He ordered his words to be carved in stone. Thus was born a series of unique historical documents known as the Edicts of Ashoka. These are more than 30 inscriptions scattered across the entire Indian subcontinent, from Afghanistan in the west to Andhra Pradesh in the south. They were carved on huge boulders, the major and minor rock edicts, and on specially erected mirror-polished sandstone pillars, the pillar edicts. The creation of these monuments required colossal resources. Huge blocks of sandstone were quarried near Chunar, worked by skilled craftsmen, and then transported hundreds or even thousands of kilometers to their installation sites. It was a most complex logistical operation. They were placed along major trade routes in large cities and near the empire's borders so that they could be seen and read or listened to as literate people read them aloud by as many people as possible. These edicts are not dry decrees or boastful reports of victories, like those of many other ancient rulers. They are a unique combination of a royal manifesto, a moral sermon, and a personal confession. In them, Ashoka, calling himself Divanampiya Piyadasi, meaning beloved of the gods, he who looks on with affection, addresses his subjects explaining the principles of his Dharma. The inscriptions were made in various languages and dialects to be understandable to the local population. Most were in various Prakrits, ancient Indian dialects, using the Brahmi script. In the northwest, where Hellenistic and Persian influence was strong, edicts in Greek and Aramaic have been found. This shows a concern for communication with subjects that was astonishing for that era. The content of the edicts reveals the full breadth of Ashoka's reforms. He not only repents for the Kalinga War in the 13th edict, but also proclaims that henceforth he considers conquest by Dharma to be the best conquest. He declares that he strives for conquest not by force but by love. He reports the construction of hospitals for people and animals, the planting of medicinal herbs, and the digging of wells and planting of trees along roads for the convenience of travelers and livestock. In the first major rock edict, he writes that whereas previously thousands of animals were killed daily in the royal kitchen, now only 2 peacocks and 1 deer are, and he promises to stop this in the future as well. The fifth pillar edict provides a long list of animals placed under protection. Aimless hunting and burning of forests were forbidden. Bloody sacrifices in the capital were sharply restricted or completely banned. In the 12th major rock edict, Ashoka directly calls for, "One should not honor only one's own religion and condemn the religion of others. One should honor other people's religions. By so doing, one promotes one's own religion and does service to the religion of others." He established a new office, the Dhamma Mahamatas. These were special officials whose duties included traveling throughout the empire, overseeing the implementation of Dharma laws, protecting people from injustice, and promoting moral principles among all strata of the population, including the inhabitants of the royal harem. Ashoka demanded impartiality and mercy from his judges. By so doing, one promotes one's own religion and does service to the religion of others. He established a new office, the Dhamma Mahamatas. These were special officials whose duties included traveling throughout the empire, overseeing the implementation of Dharma laws, protecting people from injustice, and promoting moral principles among all strata of the population, including the inhabitants of the royal harem. Ashoka demanded impartiality and mercy from his judges. He introduced a 3-day respite for those sentenced to death, so their relatives could appeal the sentence or the condemned could prepare for death. The pinnacle of this stone legacy are the famous pillars of Ashoka. The most famous of these capitals is the lion capital of Sarnath. It depicts 4 lions standing back to back, looking in the 4 cardinal directions, symbolizing the spread of the Buddha's teaching or the emperor's power throughout the world. Originally, they held a huge stone wheel on their backs, the Dharma chakra, the wheel of law. It is this capital, without the wheel, that is today the official emblem of the Republic of India, and the Dharma chakra adorns its national flag. Thus Ashoka created his eternal sermon. He spoke to his people through stone, and this voice has reached us across the millennia. He turned his empire into a vast field for a social and moral experiment. But his ambitions extended far beyond India. Originally, they held a huge stone wheel on their backs, the Dharma chakra, the wheel of law. It is this capital without the wheel that is today the official emblem of the Republic of India, and the Dharma chakra adorns its national flag. Thus Ashoka created his eternal sermon. He spoke to his people through stone, and this voice has reached us across the millennia. He turned his empire into a vast field for a social and moral experiment. But his ambitions extended far beyond India. The emperor who had renounced military conquests had not renounced conquest altogether. He had merely changed his weapon. The sword was replaced by the word, and the goal became not land, but the hearts and minds of people. Ashoka conceived of turning Dharma into a world phenomenon, and Buddhism from a local Indian religion into a global teaching. His foreign policy became an extension of his domestic mission. But before carrying the teaching abroad, it was necessary to put things in order at home. By that time, the Buddhist community, or Sangha, was no longer unified. Different schools interpreted the Buddha's words differently, which led to disputes and disagreements. Moreover, the emperor's generous patronage had attracted many unworthy people to the Sangha, who took monastic vows for selfish reasons, expecting an easy life at the treasury's expense. To purify the Sangha and establish orthodox doctrine, around 250 BCE, Ashoka convened the Third Buddhist Council in Pataliputra. Under the chairmanship of the respected monk Moggaliputta Tissa, the council, in which thousands of monks participated, condemned heretical views and codified the canon of sacred texts known as the Tipitaka, meaning 3 baskets of teachings. The Theravada school, or the teaching of the elders, was recognized as the most orthodox. It was after this council that the most extensive missionary activity in the history of the ancient world began. Ashoka sent Dharma envoys to the most diverse corners of the known world. In his edicts, he proudly lists the rulers to whom he sent his missions. This list is astonishing. It includes the Hellenistic kings of the West, Antiochus II Theos of the Seleucid Empire in Syria and Persia, Ptolemy II Philadelphus of Egypt, Antigonus Gonatas of Macedonia, Magas of Cyrene in modern Libya, and Alexander of Epirus in western Greece. One can only imagine the dialogues that might have taken place at the courts in Alexandria or Antioch, where Buddhist monks explained the teachings of karma and rebirth to Stoic and Epicurean philosophers. We do not know how successful these missions to the West were. The Greek world, with its own rich philosophical tradition, was probably not ready to embrace an Indian teaching en masse. However, the very fact of these embassies testifies to Ashoka's incredible breadth of vision and his global ambitions. He saw himself not just as an Indian king, but as a world leader, bringing the light of Dharma to all humanity. Perhaps some ideas did seep into the West, influencing certain philosophical currents, but this remains in the realm of speculation. Far more successful were the missions to the south and east. The most famous and important mission was sent to the island of Lanka or Ceylon, modern Sri Lanka. And it was led, according to tradition, by the emperor's own children, his son, the monk Mahinda, and his daughter, the nun Sangamita. Mahinda arrived in Ceylon and converted the local king, Devanampia Tissa, who, in a sign of respect for Ashoka, even adopted his title Beloved of the Gods. Buddhism spread rapidly throughout the island, and Ceylon for many centuries became a stronghold of Theravada teaching, preserving the canonical texts in the Pali language. Later, Sangamita also arrived on the island. She brought with her a sapling of the sacred Bodhi tree, the very tree under which the Buddha attained enlightenment. This sapling was planted in the capital, Anuradhapura, and according to tradition, its descendant grows there to this day, being one of the main shrines of the Buddhist world. He became the first ruler in history to systematically and purposefully use soft power, cultural and ideological influence as the main instrument of international policy. He transformed Buddhism from one of many Indian teachings into a religion with global ambitions, and it is largely to his efforts that Buddhism owes its status as one of the great religions of humanity. Even the greatest eras come to an end. Even the most solid empires built on the noblest ideals are subject to the inexorable flow of time. The last years of Ashoka's reign were marred by difficulties and perhaps disappointment. His great moral experiment clashed with the harsh reality of human nature and political intrigue. There are several theories explaining the rapid decline of the empire after his death. Firstly, the huge expenditures on building stupas, monasteries, and hospitals, and on the generous support of the Buddhist Sangha, probably exhausted the state treasury. Legends tell that at the end of his life, Ashoka's ministers tried to limit his donations, fearing state bankruptcy. Secondly, his policy of non-violence may have led to a weakening of the army's martial spirit, which for centuries had been the backbone of the state. The absence of wars and conquest campaigns deprived the Kshatriya aristocracy of its main function and source of income. Thirdly, and perhaps a key factor, was the growing Brahmanical opposition. The Brahmin priestly caste, whose influence and income had suffered from the ban on many rituals and bloody sacrifices, as well as from the rise of a new, unorthodox ideology, harbored resentment. Ashoka's Dharma, with its universalism and direct appeal to the people, undermined the exclusive right of Brahmins to be intermediaries between humans and the divine, which was a direct challenge to their centuries-old social and spiritual authority. There was also unrest in the emperor's own family. Buddhist legends tell the tragic story of his son, Kunala. Ashoka's younger wife, Queen Tisharaksha, conceived a passion for her stepson. Being rejected, she decided to take revenge. Taking advantage of the emperor's illness, she sent an order in his name to Taxila, where Kunala was governor. In the order, she cunningly replaced one word with the result that the governor was instructed to gouge out his own eyes. Filial duty was so strong that Kunala, not doubting the authenticity of his father's order, carried it out. When Ashoka learned what had happened, he was filled with rage and grief, but it was too late. This story, like many others, is probably legendary, but it reflects the atmosphere of palace intrigue that thickened around the aging emperor. Ashoka died around 232 BCE, after a reign of nearly 40 years. With his death, the colossal personal will that had held together his unique empire of Dharma also departed. Immediately after his death, a rapid disintegration began. Taking advantage of the emperor's illness, she sent an order in his name to Taxila, where Kunala was governor. In the order, she cunningly replaced one word with the result that the governor was instructed to gouge out his own eyes. Filial duty was so strong that Kunala, not doubting the authenticity of his father's order, carried it out. When Ashoka learned what had happened, he was filled with rage and grief, but it was too late. This story, like many others, is probably legendary, but it reflects the atmosphere of palace intrigue that thickened around the aging emperor. Ashoka died around 232 BCE, after a reign of nearly 40 years. With his death, the colossal personal will that had held together his unique empire of Dharma also departed. In the northwest, new waves of conquerors poured into a weakened India, the Greco-Bactrians and then the Sakas and Kushans. The greatest empire in the history of ancient India, built by 3 generations of outstanding rulers, ceased to exist. Ashoka's name sank into obscurity. New times came for India, an era of fragmentation, new dynasties, and new religions. The great pacifist emperor was almost forgotten. He remained only a legendary character in Buddhist texts, a righteous king from fairy tales. His stone edicts, scattered across the subcontinent, were silent. The scripts in which they were covered, Brahmi and Kharosthi, fell out of use, and no one could read them anymore. For nearly 2,000 years, his true greatness, his reforms, his philosophy, and his repentance remained a secret, locked in mute stones. The pillars were considered to be either the staves of the epic hero Bhima or were attributed to the gods. The revival of Ashoka began only in the 19th century, with the arrival of British colonialists in India. Among them were many curious officials and scholars who were interested in the antiquities of this mysterious country. One of them was James Prinsep, an official of the Mint in Calcutta and a passionate antiquarian. He became fascinated with deciphering the ancient inscriptions found all over India. Using inscriptions on bilingual coins of the Greco-Bactrian kings, he, step by step, letter by letter, cracked the code of the ancient scripts. In 1837, Prinsep was finally able to read the edicts. He discovered that all these inscriptions from Afghanistan to Odisha were made by order of the same king who called himself Devanampiya Piyadasi. Soon, by comparing this data with the Ceylonese Buddhist chronicles where this title was associated with the great king Ashoka, scholars realized they had made one of the greatest historical discoveries. The legendary Ashoka from the books and the real Piyadasi who spoke from the stone were one and the same person. The world was stunned. History had gained a ruler unlike any other. Not just a conqueror like Alexander or Caesar, but a thinker on the throne, a philosopher who, after a cruel war, repented and tried to build a state on principles of compassion and nonviolence. Ashoka's legacy proved to be incredibly multifaceted and enduring. For India, he became a symbol of its former unity and a golden age. When India gained independence in 1947, its leaders, such as Jawaharlal Nehru, turned to Ashoka's legacy to find symbols for the new, secular, and democratic state. The lion capital became the emblem, and the wheel of Dharma, the central element of the flag. Ashoka became the embodiment of the ideal of a just and humane ruler. For Buddhism, his role is impossible to overestimate. Not just a conqueror like Alexander or Caesar, but a thinker on the throne, a philosopher who, after a cruel war, repented and tried to build a state on principles of compassion and non-violence. Ashoka's legacy proved to be incredibly multifaceted and enduring. For India, he became a symbol of its former unity and a golden age. When India gained independence in 1947, its leaders, such as Jawaharlal Nehru, turned to Ashoka's legacy to find symbols for the new, secular, and democratic state. The lion capital became the emblem and the wheel of Dharma, the central element of the flag. Ashoka became the embodiment of the ideal of a just and humane ruler. For Buddhism, his role is impossible to overestimate. Was he a sincere convert, shocked by the horrors of war? Or was he a brilliant and cynical politician who understood that in his patchwork empire, full of different peoples and beliefs, the ideology of Dharma, preaching unity and tolerance, was a more effective instrument of governance than brute force? Perhaps the truth, as is often the case, lies somewhere in between. Ashoka was both a deeply religious man and a pragmatic emperor. An idealist and a realist coexisted within him. The story of Ashoka is not just a tale of an ancient king. It is an eternal parable about power and responsibility, about violence and compassion, about destruction and creation. Was he a sincere convert, shocked by the horrors of war? Or was he a brilliant and cynical politician who understood that in his patchwork empire, full of different peoples and beliefs, the ideology of Dharma, preaching unity and tolerance, was a more effective instrument of governance than brute force? Perhaps the truth, as is often the case, lies somewhere in between. Ashoka was both a deeply religious man and a pragmatic emperor. An idealist and a realist coexisted within him. The story of Ashoka is not just a tale of an ancient king. It is an eternal parable about power and responsibility, about violence and compassion, about destruction and creation. It is the story of a man who reached the pinnacle of worldly power, looked into the abyss of the evil he had wrought, and found in himself the strength to try to atone for it by transforming his empire into a kingdom of justice. His empire collapsed, but his ideas carved in stone and in the hearts of people have survived the centuries, continuing to inspire today. He was a king who wanted to be remembered not for the battles he won, but for the good he did, and in this lies his true and eternal victory. Thank you for taking this long journey with us. If you enjoyed this immersion into history, please subscribe to our channel. Give it a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Many more amazing stories await us.